I've been reading over the years about different suspensions and things like that, and while this one clearly isn't the prettiest, it actually did work pretty well, except for a couple of factors. One is that my top link on my three link that I originally had on here was too short and too much of an angle to keep a good pinion angle on the rear differential. So when, especially in high flex situations, it caused a little bit of backward rotation or warpage on the axle, and it just didn't do real well in that situation. It never bound because my shocks don't allow for that. However, with that kind of degree of angle, it wasn't good for the U-joints and all that on the axle, so that was definitely a concern. However, the bigger concern is that I overheated the metal on the crossmember when I was trying to weld the tabs for the 3-link on top. And just to give you kind of a background on what's going on, what happened with this truck is that I started out working on this vehicle with a flux core MIG welder, and the motor burnt out on the wire feed or the wire drive, and so I, for money reasons, had to go buy me a stick welder. Well, so I had to learn how to stick weld on this vehicle in out of position areas, which was neither smart nor was it very beneficial. So surprisingly enough, my welds have actually held up through a lot over the years. But I had to make quick repairs and adjustments from time to time, just trying to keep it running. As I mentioned before, I was driving it daily and working on it at nights. And so now I'm trying to go back and fix this a little bit, because another thing that happened is I have trooper springs from an Isuzu Trooper. Somebody gave them to me on the back end, hoping that they would be a small enough diameter to fit on top of the axle and still work. Thing is, they're a little bit too high of a pound per inch weight rate, so it really made the rear end really stiff and bouncy. Now, I do have appropriate springs now. I got some springs that are 200 pounds, which they should be, not in weight, but in pounds per inch. And those are exactly what this truck had originally. The difference is, originally, the rear link arms had the springs on top of the link arm, or the trailing arm. And because it kept wearing out bushings and I couldn't find decent fitting bushings here in Chile, I went with spring over axle, trying to eliminate that problem. Since then, I haven't had any problem, but there are a few issues with this design. These shock tabs clearly are a really, really bad design. They rub the shock. They don't hold the shock tab or the shock bushing tight, so they wore out all the bushings. The springs on top, they are too big for the buckets. Have to change that. Well, the springs are getting changed out. And I have to put the 3-link back in. And because of what I mentioned before of overheating the crossmember on top, the actual tabs ripped a chunk out of the crossmember on top. So I know nothing I say really makes this better. While I'm definitely not an expert suspension fabricator, I have learned a lot in the last 3 years. My welding skills, while not expert quality by any means, have gotten a lot better. And I really want this truck to be much better, and so that's what I'm doing with all of this right now. So to really get started on it, we're going to have to take some measurements. And what I'm going to do is take some measurements. This right now, if you watch, so the axle has no support by the jack itself other than the most minimal pressure, just so that the axle isn't hanging on the struts, because I don't want, or the shocks, because I don't want the shocks to have to endure that weight for a long period of time. However, I do need to take the measurement from center eye, the center of the bolt, to the center of the bolt on top as well, to get the overall length. And then I'll take the springs out, and then I'll compress the axle to where it starts to lift the truck up slightly, and then I'll take the measurement because that's where the shocks will be completely compressed. That way I know how much distance I have to work with. Now, these numbers will be somewhat relative, and the reason they'll be somewhat relative is because I'm changing the shock mount points. Clearly these shock tabs are getting taken away. They're too thin, they're bad design on both sides, and I'll be putting new ones on. But to do all of this, and the reason I'm taking the measurements now is because I'm actually going to pull this axle out from under the truck. So when I do all my work on the axle now, I will be working on it on a more flat surface and out from under the truck. So what do I need? Well, I need the overall distance between chassis rail and axle platform, or the spring bucket on top of the platform. I'll need the overall distance that the shock can travel, and if I'm not mistaken, these are 10-inch travel shocks. I will also need the positioning from front to back of where the axle sits in relative position. And in this case, I have two links that have been squared up on the chassis, so I know how far back they'll sit based on putting those back, as long as none of the adjustments get moved. And then I will also need to make sure that I take a measurement of the pinion angle with an angle finder to make sure that when I put it back in, everything aligns, and to make sure that when I'm doing all this work on the axle, I keep in mind that the platform should sit in an angle appropriate to the pinion angle that I need off the front of the differential. So I'll need to take the pinion angle off the transfer case and off the axle itself to make sure that everything aligns in that way. And that's what I'm going to get started doing now.
So here you can see me take out the drive shaft just because I'm taking the axle out, and then I used an impact gun to help me take out the rest of the axle as well, the links and all that kind of stuff. And instead of disconnecting the handbrake or the emergency brake at the drum, I decided to actually disconnect it at the handbrake itself. And then here you can see me under here still going at getting everything taken apart. And I also had to go back and take off all the brake lines because it's just easier to keep them protected that way, and you don't want to forget the axle vent as well. Here you can see that I actually had the axle out from under the truck, and these are some of the welds on the different things, like the bump stops I made and the extension for the pannard arm that need to be cleaned up. And here is how the axle was with the relocation cones, and you can see that while they weren't the prettiest, they were solidly made, and now I'm going to clean all that off, and that's what I'm doing here. Now I'm using a cutoff wheel with the angle grinder, and you have to be really careful because even with the small cutoff wheel on a normal angle grinder, 4.5, it's pretty tight. You want to try to avoid cutting things if you can help it. But if you make small cuts, you can always go back and re-weld them in. Here, you can see that I am using a grinding disc, which is not very typical for me. But it was I had welds in such difficult places I couldn't actually use a cutoff wheel or a flap wheel and get it done quickly. So I use the grinding disc here, and then even though you don't see it, I go back and I use a flap wheel, and I take off all the rest of that, and I made it all really smooth and ready for me to get the new shock tabs mounted on. And I did on this on both sides as well.
For me to get to about this condition with the Rocky, or the Daihatsu 4-track, whatever you want to call it, it's taken me around 6 hours of actual work. Now, it's taken me 2 days just because of life and stuff like that goes on, but it's actually only taken me around 6 hours to disconnect the axle, pull it out by myself from under the Jeep, and then also do all the cleanup. And some of the cleanup on this one wasn't too easy because I had some funky shock tabs attached solidly. So it took me a while cutting and grinding and all that kind of stuff. Then on top of that, I had to go back and I had to cut off the relocation cones that you saw in the beginning on the axle there. And I also had to go back and clean up some of the welds from where this piece here had originally been mounted for the top link of the 3-link system. Now I've got the bottom of the chassis, that cross member that was broke, I've got that all cleaned up. I've got the upper spring seats on the bottom of the chassis rails all cleaned up. And I've also got the back of the actual lower link mounts prepared for me to weld on the shock tabs to that. While I was at it, I went ahead and I actually trimmed up the shock mount tabs on top because they were rubbing against the top of the shock as well. And why I have everything apart, I might as well fix it all. As you can probably see, this all looks much better. It's much smoother. Now, this piece here being rusted is not such a big deal because it's really, really thick metal, and I can take most of that rust off and then use a rust converter on it to get it better. But the real question is, do I really want to use it? So I've got to figure out what I'm going to do with that. And then with this here, I've got to try to take these springs and I'm going to design a spring locator on the bottom and on the top to hold those springs in place where they should go. And the idea is that this spring will actually sit more vertical by itself than leaning forward and off to the side. While I have the ideas for all this ready and I'm actually starting to draw them out so that they can be done, we're going to stop the show here because you were able to see what it took for me to get this apart. So as we get going on all this stuff in the next episodes, you'll start to see this Jeep really take form, and I've got to really get up to par on it because I've got some major decisions to make based on how I want my 3-link to work. Till next time, thanks again. My name is Eric. This is Beginners Fab, and I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Please make sure you comment, subscribe. Go to beginnersfab.com to see more information, and don't forget to check out my new podcast as well, offroadindependence.com. That's offroadindependence.com. You can also see all of this under one main website at ericmcgrew.tv. And I hope to see you in the next episode.